Yeah, my name is Frank Rose, and I want to talk a little bit about the idea of story worlds, which is to say, taking the world in which a story takes place and expanding it a bit, reimagining it, and making room for the reader or the viewer to explore it on their own. I'm going to start with one that I worked on, which also involved The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the David Fincher film. This was basically my job was to become Michael Blomkvist for a while. Now, Daniel Craig didn't really have anything to worry about because I was Michael Blomkvist, the writer, and I left all that stunt stuff to him. The first job I tackled was the expose that got him in trouble, the Wennerstrom expose. So, what I did was to kind of imagine how this fictional character would have written this story. I've been a reporter myself for quite a number of years, and it wasn't actually all that hard to do. I also had to take a deep dive into Stockholm, into the world of the story. It had been a while since I'd been here, but it's kind of remarkable what you can do these days with virtual research. So I familiarized myself, among other things, with the building on Belmasgatan where Blomkvist lived, and of course with Kavarnen. Lisbeth Salander's favorite pub. I spent a lot of time looking at maps, studying maps of Sweden and of Stockholm. And in the end, in addition to writing the expose, I ended up writing material for an issue of Millennium magazine that would have come out after his conviction for libel, including this profile by a movie critic I made up named Gunnar Larsson. What happened ultimately with all this was I was working with a company called 42 Entertainment, which is an outfit in Burbank. They spend a lot of time working with Hollywood movie studios and directors and producers on expanding the story of the film. They worked with Trent Reznor on his Year Zero project, which is actually how I first encountered them several years ago as a reporter for Wired, working on a story about alternate reality games. In this case, this was part of a larger project that they were developing with Fincher to explain his take on the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. What they were doing involved a lot of puzzles, which provided clues for treasure hunts for items from the movie, like these dried flowers you see. Each time one of these items was found, it would appear on this grid. And what you see here is the completed grid, where after everything has been found. In addition to the flowers, you had Lisbeth Salander's leather jacket and her motorcycle helmet. You had, kind of most remarkably, a vintage episode of Hard Copy. That's that VHS tape on the upper right. Hard Copy, of course, is an American TV show that was fairly popular in the 80s and 90s. It was a little bit sleazy, kind of sensationalistic, and in this case, what you had was a tape, I think it was about 9 minutes long, where they explored the disappearance of Harriet Viner. If you look at the far upper right, you see the issue of Millennium magazine with the ill-fated expose, and then down below that, you see Blomkvist in chains. the other issue. So the truth is that we've wanted to immerse ourselves in stories like this since, pretty much since stories began. As I was working on the book that The Art of Immersion, where I was exploring all this, I realized that Cervantes wrote Don Quixote at a time when the idea of any printed book that wasn't the Bible was still quite new. And Don Quixote was a satire, of course, about a man who immersed himself in tales that were set in the age of chivalry, immersed himself so deeply, as Cervantes wrote, he so buried himself in his books that he read all night from sundown to dawn and all day from sunup to dusk, until with virtually no sleep and so much reading, he dried out his brain and lost his sanity. And so what happened then, of course, was he went tilting at windmills. So Don Quixote lost his mind from reading too much. But despite Cervantes' cautionary tale, people did keep recklessly reading and immersing themselves in stories, never mind the consequences. Which brings us a couple of hundred years later to this fellow. This is Dickens at 27. The year was 1839. He had just published Oliver Twist. I bring him up because, in a way, he's the best model we have before the present day of the sort of participatory storytelling that I'm talking about here. He came along at a time when England was undergoing massive, overwhelming technological change. The industrialization, people moving to the cities, from the countryside. The countryside sort of emptying out and people jamming together in cities with no sanitary facilities, with no, really no way of accommodating them because that's where the work was. So they were living in these, appalling and miserable conditions. The whole country was in a way kind of disoriented and confused because the old ways were all changing. The new industries were springing up and old ones were dying. In other words, it's not entirely unlike it is today. So there was one change, though, that was very good for publishing, which is with everybody moving to cities, for the first time, literacy rates started going up fairly dramatically. In the 1830 census in England, it was estimated that about 50% of the male population could read and write. By 1840, that percentage was up to 67, so 2/3 of the men and half of the women by that point, which meant that publishers and authors had a whole new audience. The problem was that most of these people had very little money, but publishers, being rather entrepreneurial, saw an opportunity here. Because the other thing they had was lots of new technology that made it much easier to publish books and newspapers, anything like that. Paper manufacture had been improved dramatically. There were much better printing presses. And of course, for the first time, there were railroads, which meant that you could distribute things around the country fairly easily and dependably. So what they decided was that they could print novels cheaply and sell them on the installment plan, meaning in installments. Serial fiction, published a few chapters at a month at a price that was cheap enough to afford. So that's what happened with Oliver Twist, and indeed with virtually all of Dickens' novels. The thing about Dickens was that he knew his audience very, very well. He knew their world because, in a way, it was the world he had grown up in. His father had been locked away in a debtor's prison when he was quite young. He was pulled out of school and put in a rat-infested bootblack factory, put to work. And a few years later, though he had this extremely unexpected success as a writer, first as a newspaper journalist, and then as an essayist, and eventually, of course, as a novelist. The novelist who wrote the story of this orphan boy who, in a workhouse, who dares to say, "Please, sir, I want some more." More rural, that is. So, as I was thinking about what I was going to do here, I remember this book. There's a fellow in New York named Jeff Jarvis who wrote a book called What Would Google Do? It's designed for business people, essentially, who are trying to find their way in this new networked world. And his suggestion was that they turn for guidance to the company that has leveraged this world more effectively than any other. So I thought I'd ask here, what would Dickens do? So Dickens, too, lived at a time when technology permitted a real participatory relationship with the story. It was very different from what came in between then and now, because the technology of the industrial age that resulted from this process that was going on when he started didn't permit this kind of relationship at all. It created mass media, which was, the first opportunity that we had to reach millions of people at once. So it was quite remarkable, and it generated whole new industries, newspapers to start with, magazines, eventually movies, radio, television, and of course book publishing as we've known it up till now. But it did not allow the audience to connect with one another or in any meaningful way with the author. And it certainly didn't allow for readers or viewers to enter the world of the story. But oddly, the technology of the 1830s and 40s did, because that was an unforeseen consequence of serialization. The time between installments gave readers a voice. And of course, Dickens, like every other author, wrote up until the last minute and only then turned it in. So it wasn't as if he wrote these novels and then they were serialized. He was writing them a few chapters at a time, just as they were being published. For a while, he worked at this magazine that he started called Master Humphrey's Clock, which was not monthly, but weekly. He did it, as he said at the time, referring to himself in the third person, to shorten the intervals of communication between himself and his readers. Now, over time, when serials and Dickens himself were long gone, people forgot this process. They forgot what this allowed, the connection with his readers. But his biographers knew, and they knew how he drew sustenance from this constant give and take. Because Dickens was in constant contact with his readers, and his readers, just like readers today, wanted to have some kind of voice in his stories. Now, he didn't always heed their wishes. In the old Curiosity Shop, which you see an illustration from here, Dickens caused complete pandemonium when it became apparent that the saintly little Nell wasn't going to make it. That here she is on her deathbed. There was a ship from England that sailed into New York Harbor. This was a time before instant television and so forth, of course. And the ship was greeted at the harbor by a crowd of people shouting, "Is little Nell dead?" Now, of course, Dickens knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't listen to his readers' wishes. That in this case, this book was an immense success. But at a time when the story wasn't going quite so well, he paid a lot more attention. A couple of years later, with Martin Chuzzlewit, a book that wasn't selling very well at all, he decided to move the action to America because that was a place that people really wanted to read about. So, what would Dickens do? Well, obviously he would have had a blog. The evidence suggests it might have looked like this. And by the way, I have to speak to you about my photoshopping budget later. Uh, and I think probably his web skills would have been pretty good, but as you can see, even he would face occasional technical difficulties. And of course, the demands of daily publication, which were even worse than weekly publication. But even so, future scholars would see the advantages of this kind of audience participation that this allowed. Now, of course, everybody has a blog. That's like saying Dickens would have gone to Comic-Con. The more interesting possibility is that he might have done like John Lanchester, the novelist in the UK who wrote Capital, a novel recently published that documents the lives of the residents of a street in South London called Pepys Road. And during Britain's ongoing financial crisis, Matt Locke, who is the ex-head of cross-platform programming at Channel 4, is now a publishing consultant, and he worked with Faber and Faber to create this Pepys Road, which is an online experience that builds out Lanchester's fictional world. As Matt said, the point is to take people inside the story world that the author created. So what if you personalize the story through a sort of game that you could go to a website, type in your name and place of birth and date of birth and the place where you live now, and wait for what happens next. So what would happen next is that you would get a series of emails and so forth over the next 10 days or so, including news stories from Lanchester that were sort of tailored to whatever your circumstances were. And you would learn in some way how you might be affected by the economic change that is being predicted over the next 10 years, the lost decade, so to speak, that economists are predicting as a result of government austerity in the UK. Here's another example, a website that's not about the book, actually, but set in the world of the book. It's a site that has to do with Volume 3 of the Strain trilogy, a series of vampire novels by Chuck Hogan and Guillermo del Toro. And this is a website for something called the Department of Human Management. The DHM was the agency that was set up after the vampires took over to sort of keep things running smoothly and to make sure that the humans were okay with this new environment where they were basically vampire food. The guy who created this website is a fellow named Andy Merkin. He's an associate of Guillermo del Toro, and he told me, you can imagine what this means, but still you're not quite sure. So what he wanted to do here was to sort of think it through. What would life really be like if this was the world that you lived in? And then, of course, we have Pottermore, which is the world of Harry Potter, created from J.K. Rowling's notes and so forth, basically. So, I don't know, would Dickens have given us Oliver more? I'm not sure about that, but there was a guy named Robert Patton, a Dickens scholar in the US, who did an online seminar called When is a Book Not a Book? And the seminar was about Oliver Twist in the context of Bentley's Miscellany, the monthly journal that Dickens edited and in which it appeared. And Patton's point was that Oliver Twist as a serial novel was very different from Oliver Twist, the bound book. So when is a book not a book? When it ceases to be an artifact and becomes a living, breathing work of art. The truth is that we've all been trained to like our books dead, finished, completed, But our readers aren't really all that excited about dead books anymore. Our readers are being trained to think of books in a different way, as story worlds full of characters and events that spark the imagination. They don't want to take over the story. They want the story to embrace them and to let them in. So what we have to do, I think, is to ask ourselves as authors and as publishers, are we in the artifact business? Are we trying to create an object of genius for everyone to admire? Or are we in the business of communicating with our readers? Are we going to share our gifts with others? And if the latter, how do we do that? I don't really have the answers here, but I do think these are the questions. I feel like we're still groping our way very much towards something that's new, a new relationship with our readers. And our job, of people in this room collectively, is to figure it out. So it's actually, I think, a pretty exciting time to be in publishing. Thank you.